So I'm going to give a very brief PowerPoint here just to go through some of the options, and then we'll jump across to using Instant JChem itself, and we'll see some of this in action. So initially, I should just point out that Instant JChem is a database-based application. That means that sitting underneath pretty well anything you do in Instant JChem is a relational database. And this is a perfectly standard, 100% normal relational database. Even if you're using a local database, it is a fully fledged SQL-compliant relational database engine. It just happens to be local and running within Instant JChem. Similarly, if you're connecting to an Oracle or a MySQL database, there's no magic going on here. It's just a standard Oracle and MySQL database. And you can perform whatever operations you want in those databases. And we're going to talk about some of what this lets you do in the way of providing information to Instant JChem. So basically, Instant JChem is a desktop tool that can be used as a front end to a database and lets you run things like structure searches and things like that. That's what the users of Instant JChem will use it for. And Instant JChem itself can be used directly to design, create and populate the database. So you can ask Instant JChem to create the tables, to import data into it and do everything. So Instant JChem can be totally in control of the database. Alternatively, Instant JChem can be used to connect to a database that already exists, that already has tables in, and those tables already have data in. And Instant JChem doesn't need to be involved with how the data gets into the database whatsoever. You can just connect Instant JChem to the database and use it to see the data that's already there in the database. Now this gives you a number of different possibilities in how you can load your data in to the database and use it. And basically, there are four main options that I see. The first one is the one that most end users would do. They do everything in Instant JChem. They might import an SD file into the database. In doing so, they'd create the tables, import the data in from the file, and do absolutely everything inside Instant JChem. Instant JChem is in complete control of the process. Alternatively, you can use Instant JChem to basically connect to existing tables in the database. And this is quite a common usage of IJC, particularly in the sort of the medium and larger size companies, where you might already have data in the database. You might have biology and chemistry data, and you just want to use Instant JChem as a read-only reporting tool. The third option is that you can design the database in Instant JChem, but you can use external processes to populate the tables. And this can be quite useful if you want to distribute a database to others. So if if you're an information provider or a compound supplier, you could use Instant JChem to build a database, populate the tables with the data, and then send that database on to your customers who want to find compounds or data within those within that database. It's quite a useful use of IJC, particularly with the local database. And finally, the entire process of creating and populating the tables can be done externally. So again, you can have the same sort of external process to generate the tables and create all the data, and then you just connect Instant JChem to the database. It's a bit like the second case, really, in many ways, but you're creating the database using some external process. Now, so let's look at these in a little bit of detail. The first one, where you do everything in IJC, you just use the standard IJC user interface to create everything. You might do that by importing the data in from files like SD files or comma-separated files, or you might create empty tables and then load the data in row by row. Once you've got your data in, you might create relationships between the tables if you want to use relational data, and then you'd assemble the data tree. That's analogous to the ISIS HView, and then you'd build some forms so that you can see and query your data. So that's the standard sort of end user thing that most people are probably familiar with. The second one is when you want to use existing tables that are in the database. And what you do in Instant JChem there is to promote those tables and columns to entities and fields. We'll come on to this sort of terminology a bit in a minute. That makes those database tables and the columns in those tables accessible to Instant JChem. You will also most likely want to promote any foreign key constraints between those tables to relationships in Instant JChem so that you can use the relational data features. And then again, the process from then on is much the same. You assemble the data tree and you'd build forms. The third option was to design the database in IJC but populate the tables externally. So basically you'd use the Instant JChem, the schema editor, to create all the entities, tables and things in Instant JChem. But then you would populate those tables externally. As I said, the database is a perfectly normal relational database, and you can use whatever methods you want to put data into that database. And then once the data's there, you might want to create the relationships between the different tables, create the data tree, and build the forms. And finally, the fourth method, where you're basically doing everything externally, you might have a script or process that creates the tables and then fills them with data, and then you go to Instant JChem, you promote the tables and everything in so that Instant JChem is aware of them, and then you assemble the data tree and build forms. So there's a general common pattern here, but the way you go about actually creating your data and creating the tables is pretty flexible. You can do it in any number of ways. You can let Instant JChem control the process, or you can control the process yourself with your own processes and your own tools. So what are the options here for populating these tables with data? Well, one thing I use quite often myself is just to use simple scripts or programs written in Java or other languages that can easily just process, let's say, some files and load them into the database. That's really quite an easy and a very suitable way of loading data in externally. Alternatively, you could do the same thing with workflow tools such as Pipeline Pilot or KNIME if you have access to those. Again, that's a very good way of loading data in. Alternatively, if the data is already in a database, you might want to use some SQL scripts to process the data into tables suitable so that it can be seen by Instant JChem, or more of a specialized case of that. If you're using Oracle, you can use Oracle materialized views to sort of extract the data out of your source data and transform it into a form that can be used by Instant JChem. And that's particularly useful if you've got the JChem cartridge, because you can add a JChem cartridge index to the any structure columns in your materialized views, and that provides you with a very good way of generating reporting systems from systems such as activity-based or other systems that might contain assay or inventory data or whatever.